So, Zach, I'm going to pass it over to you here. Jalen Guyton ranked 194th on Jamie's list. It's all yours.
Don't worry, guys. I won't just be praising everything Jamie does, but I got to start off with some love here because Jalen Guyton's a true sleeper. I love that Jamie had him as a draftable guy. Would I have had him behind Tyron Johnson? Probably not. But he didn't show too much in his second season, but he was third in targets per game among the team's wide receivers. If he can hold on to his role of wide receiver 3, Guyton could way outplay his current value. And look, the Chargers' new offensive coordinator, Joe Lombardi, he loves to pass the ball. We know that. On top of that, this is an offense already built to run 3 receiver sets. They ran out of that formation more than all but 5 teams last season, which could mean Guyton sees the field, say, at least 70% of the time. There's clearly room for Guyton to make an impact, especially since LA could be among one of the top passing teams in the league. I'll take a flyer on Guyton, especially with the uncertainty surrounding Mike Williams. So we'll start off with a little praise there. I hope you agree with me, Jamie.
We got to get some defensive love in the show. Are you kidding me? The Colts defense. Zach, it's all yours.
Well, listen, I'm always happy to talk about one of the most overlooked aspects in fantasy. Maybe, I don't want to say I'm lying or cheating here, because I kind of want to talk about all the defenses you have in this range. And look, I know you guys brought me on to talk about, the nitty and the gritty with the teams and the players and provide the hard-hitting analysis. I kind of did that for this one because for as long as I can remember, I've streamed defenses and kickers. Unless it's the last 2 rounds, I just don't see why I should waste draft capital on a unit that I can easily replace each week. So, to support my theory, I looked at my own championship-winning fantasy team from last season. In my 15-week season, I replaced my starting defense in all but 3 weeks, and I had one negative performance, but I digress. Even then, my defense's average 10.6 fantasy points. Last number 1 defense was the Rams, who finished with 9.9 fantasy points per game. This year you have Colts defense. I think it's defense 7, right? Well, I like that ranking overall. That puts them, I believe, in the 15th round. That's fine, but I just had to point out that if you're taking defenses before the final 2 rounds, you might want to rethink your strategy. That's my strategy. Hopefully you guys agree with me on that.
This is where we bring Zach in to save us here and move this show along. It's player 160 for you on the board, Zach, that you would like to discuss. Kirk Cousins, quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings.
Yeah, well, listen, guys. Listen, Jamie. I know you brought me on, hoping I'd give you the praise the entire show. I gotta grill into you a little bit here, and it's easy to see Kirk Cousins as your QB18 and think it's a fine landing spot. I don't think anyone thinks he's a top 10 or even top 15 player at the position, and that's fine. I don't think much changes from last season over to this one when it comes to Cousins. And as you know, the best forecaster for future fantasy success can be past fantasy success if a player's situation remains generally the same. That's true for Cousins, who in 2020 averaged 19.1 fantasy points per game, the 12th most of the position. But guess what? Cousins was also the overall quarterback 6 in the final 9 weeks of the season. He was also a top 12 quarterback in all but 3 of the final 9 weeks, meaning you could have started him regularly. Yeah, Cousins doesn't have the upside of a Justin Herbert or the potential volume of a Joe Burrow, but he can still be a fine consolation prize later in drafts. I'd probably pick him ahead of where you have him.
Good luck trying to figure out the Patriots running back situation, Zach.
I think I could do my best. And listen, as much as I love me some Trey Sermon this year, I will totally take the dice. I will totally roll the dice on Damien Harris. Jamie, you have him behind players like James Conner, Kenyon Drake, Jamal Williams. But I think Harris has a good chance to be the main running back in New England. And no, I'm not worried about James White. His role has decreased in recent years. As for Harris, he led the Patriots in touches per game last season, which does mean something coming into this year. And I know Bill Belichick doesn't love to show his cards. We never really know exactly what he's thinking until he actually does it. But it does say something that Damien Harris, among running backs, to see at least 24 touches, was first in touch rate per snap, ahead of every major running back, ahead of Zeke Elliott, ahead of Derrick Henry. And while this signals just a limited role, it does suggest that Harris, if he sees a few more snaps per game, his fantasy production would improve dramatically from his 9.1 scoring in PPR formats. Unless he gets outplayed by like Ramondre Stevenson, Harris is something no running back has in his current range, a good chance to be a featured back I'd target him a bit earlier than where you have him.
It brings me great joy that one of the players that we talked about this week is a player that Zach wants to feature right now during the show, because Jamie was pulling his hair out when discussing this player. Irv Smith Jr. is the guy for you, Zach, that you would like to discuss. So let's see if we can make Jamie pull a little bit more of that hair out.
Oh, man, I am so happy to get to contribute to this conversation because, Jamie, you have Irv Smith Jr. as your tight end 11. And while he certainly may have the talent to ascend that high, I need to pump the brakes just a little bit here. A couple of weeks ago, Mike Zimmer said Smith Jr. is not the Vikings tight end to be getting a bigger role, but rather it's Tyler Conklin, who's also pretty underrated as a pure talent. So let's say Conklin takes on Kyle Rudolph's role from 2020, which he did do in the final 4 weeks anyway. In that span, Conklin saw just one more target than Smith. Now, Smith did outscore Conklin in fantasy during that time, but targets provide a clearer picture at each player's involvement. Extrapolate their targets per game across a 16-game season, and both of them would have seen about 80 targets per game, which would have been in the top 14 at the position. While it's encouraging that Minnesota attempted their most passes since 2017, it's just not plausible for Smith and Conklin to each see at least 80 targets based on how this offense operates. I can't see Smith matching your projections as long as Conklin sees the field.
Zach, why is Courtland Sutton on your mind?
Listen, I promise I'll share some love as we get deeper into the rankings. This has been fantasy gold so far. Talking about Odell Beckham, I kind of almost forgot about him, to be honest. But one guy that a lot of people seem to forget is Courtland Sutton. He's just not getting talked about enough. Jamie, you have Sutton as your wide receiver 43, which is lower than his ADP of wide receiver 30. After missing last season with an ACL injury, we'll have to dip back into Sutton's production and usage from 2019 and see how Vic Fangio's offense operated. As expected, not much change in terms of passing tendencies and output, which bodes well for Sutton's projection. So in 2019, Sutton was far and away the Broncos' top receiver. But since then, Noah Fant and Jerry Jeudy have become viable options. So let's say that those two guys average 2 targets per game fewer than they did last season. And Sutton comes in and averages 6 targets per game, which even then, that's an extreme projection of devaluation for Sutton. He can still see north of 8 targets per game in 2021. Pair that with Sutton's talent, and I like him not just as Denver's wide receiver 1, but I like him as a top 30 receiver regardless of who's throwing him the ball.
For Zach, it's a conversation about Ryan Tannehill. So we will see here if he agrees with you about what to expect from the Titans offense.
Yeah, we kind of need to talk more about this Titans offense, specifically with Tannehill. And he's your QB8, and honestly, I don't hate it. I really don't. He's continuously been underrated in fantasy circles, but you have him ahead of Aaron Rodgers and Justin Herbert. And that's what I'm a little weary about. If you're looking for a consistent, solid QB1, Tannehill's fine. He can be your guy for that. Your rankings value him as an early 7th round pick in a 12-team league. But if I'm targeting a quarterback in that area, I want someone with top 5 upside. Tannehill doesn't really have that long term. What I mean by that is, can he be the highest scoring quarterback in a week or two? Yeah, of course he can. He's done it before. But the top 5 quarterbacks in fantasy last season all threw for more than 500 passes. Tannehill was close, but he threw nearly 100 fewer passes than Herbert. Again, I don't want to overrate production from a previous season when projecting a future season, but a lot of times, like I said, future fantasy success can be forecast by looking at past fantasy success. And essentially, this supports the idea that a top 5 quarterback should be the centerpiece of their offense. Allen, Mahomes, Murray, Watson, Rodgers, they were their offenses. Lamar Jackson in 2019 didn't hit the passing threshold, but he ran the ball at a historic rate. Even with the addition of Julio Jones, who, again, I agree with where you have Julio, even then, you may be a bit higher on him than I am. It's hard to see Mike Vrabel leading an offense with 500 pass attempts for his first time ever. Rodgers and Herbert, they're the focal points of their offense. Tannehill isn't. Although, I'd still be perfectly fine with Tannehill as a quarterback 1.
It's Tyler Boyd who's on the mind of Zach. So, Zach, Tyler Boyd.
Jamie, you have Tyler Boyd as wide receiver 22. And I got to say, I love it. I love it. It's perfect. I continue to be surprised by Boyd's ADP. Forget the consistency he showed the last 3 seasons. With Burrow, Boyd was on pace to finish as wide receiver 13 while seeing the 11th most targets per game among all wide receivers. Without Burrow, Boyd finished as wide receiver 29, saw the 29th most targets per game. It wasn't good. It wasn't good at all. Jamar Chase may steal a target or two from Boyd, but Chase will mostly impact T. Higgins due to Boyd's role in the slot. If you're looking for a high floor receiver in the middle rounds, Boyd is your guy. So I think he's exactly where he should be in your rankings. Everything you just said about Jamar Chase applies to, and with the terms of how that offense is going to operate. So I am all in on this Bengals offense and Tyler Boyd.
Zach wants to talk about Myles Gaskin.
Yeah, Jamie, I loved where you have Boyd, and I really liked where you had Myles Gaskin, too. He averaged 16.4 points per game in PPR formats last season, 11th most among running backs to play at least 6 games. Take that, extrapolate that past 10 games, the 10 games he played in, and he would have finished as an RB1. For this season, let's say Gaskin averages 17 carries a game, just like he did in the 7 games he started last season. Assuming he's still on par with his production, Gaskin could be earning at least a point per carry. Obviously, it's expected that no player replicates his stats from a prior season, but in this case, that would place Gaskin as a firm RB1, meaning he would be among the top 12 running backs in your league. And there aren't any reasons to suggest Gaskin can't be that 17 carry guy again in 2021. I like where you have him, and I'd even consider him over Miles Sanders and David Montgomery.
Are we going to close on a good note for Jamie?
I think I gave him enough praise in the last 2 turns. Let's end on something that just kind of makes me scratch my head a little bit in A.J. Brown. Listen, no one's denying he's a young star on the rise, especially in fantasy. In case you didn't know, though, Julio Jones is a Tennessee Titan. While I don't expect him to return to his elite form, I do expect Jones to limit Brown's ceiling just a bit. We can really use the benchmark set by Corey Davis last year as a clue to how Brown will fare this season. Brown averaged 7.6 targets per game, while Davis averaged 6.8. Let's assume that Jones slides into Davis's role, and signs indicate that's what's going to happen. Now, the top 5 receivers in 2020 last year were all in the top 6 of targets per game, excluding Tyreek Hill, who was 8th with 9 targets a game, I believe. So for Brown to reach Hill's threshold, the Titans would need to pass, say, 2 to 3 times more per game, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that would mean they're throwing the ball more than 32 times per game. That's never happened in a Mike Vrabel offense, even with Tannehill at quarterback. Look, Brown's a top 10 fantasy receiver, hands down, no questions asked. I just don't think I'll see enough volume to warrant a top 5 selection at the position. That's my final thoughts on this. If you had asked me to give thoughts on all 200 players and teams, I'll do it in a heartbeat, but I don't think anyone wants to sit at their computer for that long.